My name is Linda Cooper, and I never expected the child I once read bedtime stories to would grow into the man standing in my dining room that evening, unbuckling his belt as if fear were the only language left between us. The house was quiet except for the faint humming of the old refrigerator and the sharp click of metal as Eric pulled the strap free. I could smell the leather before I could fully understand what he meant to do. At 67, you know the scent of danger long before it reaches you. It comes as a tightening in your chest, a coldness in your hands, a whisper that says you should run. But there was nowhere to go in my own home. He placed a stack of papers in front of me, the kind of legal forms I had learned to dread. He wanted my signature. Again. "Just sign it, Mom," he said, his voice low, almost rehearsed. Behind him, Jenna leaned against the doorway with her arms folded, her smile thin and bright like a blade. She bounced my granddaughter, little Lila, on her hip as if this were all some harmless family disagreement instead of a robbery unfolding in daylight. I tried to steady my breath, but the air felt heavy, like it no longer belonged to me. The last time I saw Eric hold a belt like that, he was a little boy showing his father how fast he could loop it through his jeans. Tonight, there was nothing innocent in his grip, only anger, only entitlement, only the belief that my fear was a resource he could harvest. He took one step closer, raising the belt just enough for the message to land. And then the doorbell rang. The sharp, unexpected chime sliced through the tension, stopping his hand mid-air. I didn't know who was on the other side of that door, but I knew that sound might be the first breath of a life I had almost lost. When that doorbell rang in the present, it felt like someone pressed a finger against the surface of my memory and everything rippled backward. The sound pulled me out of my dining room and back into a different house, a smaller one, where the carpet smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and my husband's boots always sat by the door. That was long before belts became weapons and signatures became currency. It was the time when storms scared my little boy, not the thought of losing control over a home he believed should belong to him. Eric was a tender child once. I don't mean fragile, just soft in a way that made people smile. When thunder shook the windows, he'd run straight to me, burying his face against my sweater. Frank would tease him gently, wrapping those big auto shop hands around him and telling him no storm could get past his dad. In those moments, I pictured a long life where the three of us would stand together against anything. Funny how fast life corrects our assumptions. The morning everything changed was so ordinary it still feels like a trick. Frank kissed my cheek before leaving for the shop, his lips cold from the January air sneaking in through the door. I made coffee. Eric gulped down cereal while practicing lines for a school play, his voice full of excitement. Hours later, I was standing under fluorescent lights, staring at a doctor whose expression told me the truth before his words finished forming. Frank had collapsed between oil drums and tool benches, and by the time help arrived, there was nothing anyone could do. It's strange how grief rearranges the air in a house. Rooms feel bigger, colder. The walls suddenly echo. That night, Eric sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa he barely sipped. He didn't cry, at least not then. He just stared at the doorway as though waiting for his father to walk back in, covered in grease and apologies. When he finally looked at me and whispered, "Mom, who's going to fix things now?" Something inside me cracked in a place that never truly healed. I promised him we'd be fine. I said it like a vow, with my jaw tight and my heart shaking. I'm not sure either of us believed it. The years after Frank's death didn't unfold neatly. They dragged. The bills came on time. My courage rarely did. I taught at the elementary school by day, tutored by evening, graded papers at night. I kept the house standing out of sheer stubbornness and the fear of what failure might do to Eric. He grew taller, his shoulders widening like his father's. But the steadiness Frank carried so easily didn't pass down with the shape of his bones. There were small moments, ones I should have paid more attention to. The bicycle incident was the first. Frank had spent weeks restoring an old Raleigh for Eric, a surprise for his 13th birthday. He polished the frame, replaced the chain, tuned the brakes until they felt feather light. Eric loved it at first. Then one afternoon, frustrated after an argument with a friend, he threw the bike against the sidewalk. The crash rang so loudly I remember a neighbor peeking out from behind her curtains. The guilt on his face lasted only a second. Then he shrugged and mumbled, "It's just a bike." I should have let the weight of that moment sit with him. I should have made him fix every bent spoke with his own hands. Instead, I waited until he went to bed and spent half the night in the garage, cleaning the dirt from the paint and straightening the handlebars while my tears left tiny speckles on the metal. I told myself he'd been through enough, that losing a father at 12 earned him softness from the world, at least for a little while. I never realized the world doesn't work on credit. It collects later, with interest. As Eric moved into his late teens, the pattern deepened. If he forgot an assignment, I helped him email the teacher. If he overslept and missed the bus, I drove him across town before first bell. If he failed to study for a test, I made flashcards and encouraged him through the night. At the time, these felt like acts of love. Only much later did I understand they were also acts of removal, removing consequences he needed to experience, removing responsibility he needed to hold. He wasn't a bad kid. He wasn't cruel. He just started believing effort was optional because I'd always fill the gap. I became the invisible cushion under his every fall, even when he tripped over the same stone again and again. By the time he reached 20, he walked with a kind of unearned confidence, not the healthy kind, the brittle kind, the kind that shatters the moment life pushes back. I saw it in the way he talked about jobs he hadn't earned, plans he hadn't prepared for, futures he hadn't built. But instead of challenging him, I smoothed the path the way I always had. Looking back, I can see the moment the scale tipped. It was a quiet Tuesday. Eric had fallen asleep on the couch, one arm dangling toward the floor, the television glowing blue across his face. I stood there watching him breathe, and for one strange second, I felt like I was looking at a man I didn't quite recognize, someone drifting, someone waiting for life to hand him things that were never promised. A thought slipped in, fragile and frightening. Maybe I had raised him with too much mercy and not enough truth. I didn't know it then. But the first cracks in our future had already formed. And once they appeared, the rest of our story moved quietly toward the moment when he would stand before me years later, belt in hand, demanding a signature I could no longer give. If part one was the space where the early cracks formed, then the years that followed were when the fractures spread, slowly at first, then all at once. Eric entered adulthood with bigger dreams than discipline. I wanted him to have ambition. I truly did. But I also hoped he'd have the steadiness his father carried so naturally. Instead, he drifted from one half-plan to another, collecting disappointments like loose change in a pocket. College was his first unraveling. He enrolled in a 2-year technical program, the kind of path Frank would have been proud of: cars, machines, practical work. For a moment, I saw a future forming. Then, 2 semesters in, he claimed the professors were unfair, the workload unrealistic, the expectations unreasonable. He insisted the world didn't need another mechanic. It needed people with vision. I drove him home the day he officially withdrew. He stared out the window while I gripped the steering wheel and pretended not to hear the whisper inside me asking what I'd done wrong. He started working at a warehouse soon after, a steady job with decent pay if you showed up on time and kept your head down. Eric did neither. Still, every time he called with a problem, his car battery died. He overdrafted his checking account. He forgot to pay a bill. I patched things up behind him. I had already spent one lifetime carrying the weight of a man I loved. It took me years to realize I was starting to carry the weight of a man I'd simply raised. Around the time he turned 27, he met Jenna. She was lively, polished, always posting photos of herself with clients from the salon where she worked. She had this energy about her, a kind of relentless desire for a shinier life than the one she grew up with. I didn't mind that. We all want better. But from the moment she walked into my living room in her high-heeled boots and perfume that arrived a second before she did, I sensed she wasn't looking for love as much as she was looking for an upgrade. Still, Eric adored her, and he looked happy. Almost boyish again, whenever she leaned in and whispered something only he could hear. I wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt. I wanted to believe he had finally found someone who would push him towards stability instead of away from it. When they announced their engagement, he hugged me tighter than he had in years. Their wedding was small but expensive, at least for people who didn't actually have the money for expensive things. I paid more than I should have, telling myself it was a mother's privilege. The way Jenna wrinkled her nose at the inexpensive flowers should have warned me. The way Eric shrugged when the photographer demanded payment up front should have warned me too. Instead, I smiled through it, writing checks I shouldn't have written. After the wedding, the bills didn't stop. Eric called often, his tone soft, apologetic at first. He needed a little help with the rent. Jenna's car needed new tires. Their old sofa made her back hurt. Every expense sounded small until they swelled together into something heavy enough to keep me awake at night, staring at my ceiling fan while whispers of doubt fluttered in the dark. Then Jenna got pregnant, and everything shifted again. When she placed my newborn granddaughter, Lila, into my arms, something in me melted. I fell in love in an instant. I thought the ache of losing Frank had shut down certain rooms in my heart forever, but Lila pushed them open without even trying. Holding her was like holding a second chance, not for Eric, but for me. I wanted to be the grandmother who showed up, the one who baked cookies and read books and kept her home warm for every visit. And for a while, that's exactly what happened. They visited often, partly because they enjoyed seeing me, but mostly because it meant free meals and free childcare. I didn't complain. I soaked in every moment with Lila. I told myself it didn't matter if they relied on me too much. Families leaned on each other. Besides, I finally felt useful again in a way that didn't involve grading papers or patching holes no one else cared about. But underneath the sweetness of those visits, something else was growing. Quiet, shadowy, easy to ignore if I wanted to. Eric became more impatient when things didn't go his way. Jenna's sighs sharpened when I didn't offer money fast enough. Their smiles tightened if I hesitated instead of reaching for my purse. And with every favor, every loan, every bill I paid, I felt a strange shift inside the house I'd worked my whole life to protect. It wasn't spoken aloud, not yet, but I could sense it. They were beginning to see my home as something meant for them, not me. I just didn't know how far they would go to claim it. Looking back, the shift wasn't sudden. It crept in the way winter does, first a cool breeze, then a darker sky, then the quiet realization that the world outside has changed, and you didn't notice when Eric and Jenna began hinting that their apartment felt cramped. Jenna said it first, while stirring sugar into her tea at my kitchen table, her voice airy and casual, as if she were commenting on the weather. "This place is so much nicer than ours," she said. scanning my living room with a wistful sigh. It must feel lonely with all this space. Eric didn't look at her. He looked at me, waiting for my reaction. I felt a pang of unease, but I smiled. "It's fine," I said. "It's home." I didn't know it was the beginning of their plan, not a malicious plan at first, but a whisper turning into a want, and then into an entitlement that grew roots. One especially cold night. Jenna called crying. Lila had a fever, and they needed help. I drove across town in the sleet, sat with my granddaughter while Jenna Googled symptoms and Eric paced anxiously. Nothing serious, just a virus. But afterward, Jenna wrapped her coat tighter and murmured, "If we lived with you, it'd be easier for everyone." I should have paused. I should have asked questions. Instead, overwhelmed by fear for Lila and love for the family I still hoped we could be, I nodded. Within a month, they moved into my house, first with gratitude, then comfort, then expectation. Their belongings filled the guest room. Their shoes lined the entryway. Their arguments spilled into my kitchen, and my once quiet home felt smaller, louder, and no longer entirely mine. At first, it wasn't all bad. Waking up to Lila's laughter down the hall felt like a blessing I hadn't dared hope for. Some mornings, I'd find Jenna at the stove, flipping pancakes while humming to the radio. Eric would be packing his lunch, occasionally kissing the top of my head as he passed. For a while, it resembled a life I'd dreamed about. Family under one roof, warmth in every room. But warmth has a way of evaporating when the bills grow heavier. Their expenses ballooned. Jenna wanted new furniture because my old sofa hurt her back. Eric insisted they contribute to groceries, but rarely did. They argued more often, especially about money, and every time they fought, they expected me to step in, soothe things, fix what I wasn't responsible for. I found myself slipping back into the role I had played for Eric his whole life, the quiet rescuer, the buffer between him and reality. Then came the day that changed everything. I had a dizzy spell in the kitchen, one sharp enough that I grabbed the counter to steady myself. The room spun, and by the time I blinked it away, Jenna was standing across from me with her arms folded and worry etched between her brows. She drove me to the ER, stayed long enough for the doctor to confirm it was blood pressure and stress, then slipped out to make phone calls while Eric worked late. That night, as I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, Eric knelt beside me with a seriousness I rarely saw in him. "Mom," he said gently, "you shouldn't be dealing with bills and the mortgage alone anymore. If something happens, we won't be able to help quickly. You should let me handle things." I should have asked for specifics. I should have asked what he meant by handle, but I was tired, scared, and softened by the way he held my hand. He reminded me I wasn't alone. He reminded me Lila needed stability, and Jenna stood behind him, nodding in slow, practiced sympathy. A week later, they brought papers to the table. Jenna's friend Mike, who worked at a local bank, came with them. He explained the document in vague terms, something about convenience, emergencies, easier access to accounts if I fell ill. None of them said power of attorney aloud, not in a way that made me understand what I was signing. I didn't see the danger. I only saw my son watching me with hope, believing I wouldn't question him. So I signed. The world didn't crack open right away. It took a few weeks, maybe months, before things began to feel off. Mail arrived with my name but addressed to account holder. Jenna spent hours online shopping, packages arriving almost daily. Eric's car suddenly changed, sleeker, newer, financed by a loan I later learned was tied to my home. They whispered more often, silencing themselves when I entered the room. They stopped asking before spending and simply assumed I'd cover whatever they needed. The unease grew into dread the day I opened a letter from a bank I'd never heard of. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I saw the words that hollowed me out from the inside. Past due mortgage payment, third notice. I sat at the kitchen table, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. My house, my sanctuary. The last piece of franc I had left had been refinanced without my knowledge, tied to debts I didn't create, and sitting in the corner, playing with her dolls. Lila looked up at me with innocent eyes, unaware of how her parents had just set fire to the foundation of the only stable home she knew. For the first time, fear and betrayal braided themselves together so tightly inside me I couldn't breathe. I realized then that everything I'd given had not been enough, and now they wanted more, something I could not afford to lose. My home. The letter from the bank lay open on my kitchen table, its language cold and final. Past due, refinanced, delinquent. Words that didn't belong to me, signed by hands I trusted. I stared at them until the lines blurred, trying to understand how the roof I'd protected for decades had been turned into collateral for debts I didn't make. When Eric and Jenna walked through the door that evening, I held the notice out to them with trembling fingers. Eric barely glanced at it. "Mom, you're overreacting," he said, as if losing a house were a small inconvenience. "It's just the refinance. It was a good deal." "It wasn't," I answered, "and it was done without me." Jenna's expression hardened. "You signed the papers. Don't make this dramatic." My breath caught. There it was, the shift from entitlement to blame. I felt something inside me close, a door that had been open far too long. That night, after they'd gone to bed, I walked through every room touched by my late husband's hands, the baseboards he sanded, the windows he replaced, the little carvings on the banister he added just to make me smile. I realized then that the people living under my roof were not protecting these memories. They were dismantling them. The next morning, I drove to see Mr. Harris, the elder law attorney Nora had mentioned. He listened as I explained everything, my voice wobbling more than once. When I finished, he said gently, "Linda, this isn't your fault, and it isn't something you have to endure." He helped me sign the revocation of the power of attorney. We sent notices by certified mail. He explained my rights, the laws protecting seniors, the steps to reclaim what was mine. It was the first time in months I felt the ground steady beneath my feet. Eric showed up 2 days later, pounding the door so hard the hinges rattled. He shouted that I'd betrayed him, that I didn't appreciate everything he'd done for this family. I didn't open the door. I simply told him I would not discuss anything without my attorney present. The silence that followed was colder than the winter air outside, but it was the first silence that belonged to me. When he finally called and asked to talk, I didn't answer. I called Mr. Harris instead. And that's how we formed the plan. Simple, legal, safe. He would be at my home. An officer would be nearby in case things escalated. I would not be alone again. Which brings everything back to the moment when Eric stood in my dining room with a belt raised, demanding my signature yet again. Only this time, the fear didn't own me. I walked toward the sound of the doorbell, opened the door, and watched my attorney and the officer step inside. Eric froze. The belt dropped. The room shifted. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt something like freedom returning to me. Quiet, steady, and entirely mine.